tell and roadie. Go tell and roadie that everybody's
Spoiler warning. If you haven't completed the game, I will be covering many of the scares contained within. So turn back now. My friend introduced me to the Re7 demo in January of 2017. At the time, we felt a lot of the hype surrounding the Silent Hills playable demo, and found the timing of Resident Evil 7's demo was the next fix to our horror gaming drought. At first, I noticed the similarity this demo had to Silent Hills, and was wondering if the setting within the house, the puzzles, and the overall perspective were feeding off of the hype from Silent Hills. Luckily, after enjoying and beating the demo, I was on board for the release of Re7. It introduced a perspective on horror that was too interesting for me to pass up. I remember watching every trailer for the game and the demo walkthroughs, figuring out the secrets it had to offer. I consider this game one of my favorite Resident Evil experiences. It may be difficult to explain this game from a perspective not tinted in roses because I've had too many hours experiencing Resident Evil 7, so I will try to capture the essence of my enjoyment in this horror game to the best of my ability and show you why it was so scary to me. This brings me to the purpose of this series. Here we will explore the depths of horror games like Resident Evil 7 to discover my favorite hair-raising moments. I hope this series helps you discover what scared you the most as well. In search of our deepest fears, I truly believe we will find more to enjoy out of our favorite horror games. This series is comprised of my full experience in Resident Evil 7 on normal and Madhouse difficulty, along with a special section that contains my first virtual reality experience. Since a lot of this series will contain my opinion, I feel it's best to continue our growth beyond just the video. So please feel free to write your ideas in the comments section, or join me in the Discord for full-on discussions. The layout of this video will be separated into sections that will each describe the atmosphere, tension, and fear I experienced at certain points of the game. Each section will be split into key topics that involve the graphics, sound effects, story, game mechanics, DLC content, and a virtual reality section. Lastly, there will be a quick summary and a rating of the overall scare factor and whether I'd recommend it to the average horror fan or not. Ready, set, go. In the visuals department, Re7 was the first Resident Evil game to use the latest RE engine. The developers utilized photogrammetry, a technique where they would create the model of an asset like a fridge or stairs in real life, and then scan it into the game to create photorealistic images. Being the first game in the series to incorporate this on a full scale, much of the images ended up with some distortion or blur. I remember the characters' faces all having a creepy pseudo-realistic look to them that I couldn't quite tell if it was on purpose or just a side effect of the game engine. The first-person perspective, although attempted and played within past RE titles, such as Darkside Chronicles and Dead Aim, was never put to its full potential until Resident Evil 7. The developers seemed to have a deep interest in this zoomed-in perspective, but I believe the push for virtual reality was the final green light for them to finally incorporate it into a main title. Part of the reason I was so interested in Resident Evil 7 is because RE5 and 6 seem so distant from its horror roots, and to see RE7 attempt the first-person perspective again was risky and gave me the impression that Capcom was looking to step back into the horror genre again. One aspect which stood out early on were the VHS tapes. Essentially, this was a mini-episode that allowed players to be taken out of context of their player character, Ethan, and into the eyes of another character for story progression. The intensity of the visuals came from the eerie, grainy film filter that filled the screen as you played on. It was interesting to feel this lingering, creepy nostalgia effect. The constant reminder because of the screen filter made it so my actions had no difference in outcome since I was playing as a person from the past who could potentially be dead at the very moment that Ethan plays the VHS tape. It ties together with the story as well, adding that creepy nostalgia effect to an already bleak setting, such as Clancy's Final Escape. Or the Sewer Gator film crew, televising a haunted reality show while exploring the Baker estate, unknowingly being led to their demise. Along with the creepy graininess and unsettling photorealism, the game accounts for some of the best gore to be seen from the Resident Evil series. The protagonist having his hand chainsawed by his dear wife Mia proved for shock value horror at its finest in the first level inside the guest house. Watching in first person as your hand spills blood in front of your face, as you are left with a stubble spurting out fountains, could only be described as traumatic for gamers unaware of the length this game goes to reel in its audience. There's a lot of body horror involved in RE7. Some of it involves bugs swarming inside and out of Mrs. Baker's orifices. Some of it involves facial damage from gunshots, like Jack Baker's boss fights. You even get to stick your arm down a dead corpse's neck hole to obtain a key. These images were thrown at you so often that you'd be surprised if you opened up a fridge and did not find a decapitated, half-mutated mold monster's head smiling back at you. Here's where my rose-tinted glasses say this game achieves this in a non-repetitive way by varying the imagery, always keeping you guessing what subgenre of horror will invade your eyeballs next. In my first analysis, I spoke of how regard the lengths RE2 Remake went to show off its impressive lighting system. I believe this success started with specific segments in RE7. I remember after escaping Mr. Baker into a secret corridor of the main house, leading to my first encounter with the Molded. This gooey tar-looking monster with giant teeth for its head. The way it wobbled towards you was unsettling as hell. It would go on to disappear from our first encounter, and as I steadily crept away from this new fear, I was on edge up until I discovered the thing of my nightmares. The basement door. One of the few times I have ever had a vivid nightmare came after encountering this descent into the basement. I just remember the first time seeing this dimly lit basement door at the bottom of a staircase. A steep staircase. The light was bright enough for the door while everything surrounding it was pitch black. I remember as I descended each step, the change of lighting from this orange tinge to a dark blue light became ever present. It was as if the game was warning me that from here on out, there was no hand-holding. As if you were a kid who finally got tall enough to ride the scary coaster, but realized you couldn't turn back after they measured your height because of everything you imagined this moment to be. Multiple times I felt throughout the game that compulsion to explore what was on the other side of said doorway. I remember as a kid visiting my grandfather and hearing noises from his basement at night. I would stand in front of the child gate to the basement and wonder what was waiting on the other side. A lot of nightmares fueled me in that moment. I remember telling myself, if I ever found a basement door as creepy as my grandfather's, I would never enter another one. And yet I did. Now, the sound wasn't nearly as extensive as RE2 Remake, but served as a precursor with a few great moments of sound design. So after I opened the basement door, I was led through some creepy corridors, oozing gooey tar, and as I moved closer to the ooze, they made this undulating pulse that sounded like the bubbling of toxic waste from a sewer mixed with the sound of a surgeon moving his hands inside of a live patient's liver. It was unsettling, and set up the environment to sound alive. The reason the environment was able to unsettle me so well was the ability for the sound to lead my expectations. A similar effect was created in the sound design of Dead Space. When entering a room full of sounds, like pipes and machines working in the background, it trains our mind to focus on the environment and to stay aware. Then, when the player enters outer space and the silence is at the forefront, besides the sound of our breath and movement, it tricks us into believing something will attack us because all the focus is on the sounds that the player character makes, rather than what he hears around us. So Dead Space uses this to play with our expectations and build the tension, all the while not even having to use a single jump scare. Just the threat of the attack is enough to keep the player on edge. Similarly, Re7 utilizes the sound in the basement to threaten an attack, but only spawns in enemies in certain areas. It's not as in-depth of a system, but it worked well enough for the dev team to return to this concept in RE2 Remake. I was disappointed that the molded had such forgettable, guttural sounds as they crept towards me. It sounded like someone making zombie noises into a microphone. I'll put up with it because the real winners of voice acting were the Baker family. The setting of RE7 takes place in Dulvey, Louisiana, on an abandoned plantation. The family that lived there were Southern folks, with plenty of personality, so when they become possessed by Evelyn and her evil infection, they maintained some semblance of that Southern hospitality. Jack Baker, for example, calls out to Ethan, our main protagonist, during his time in the main house.
Ethan! Ethan! Ethan!
It is chilling to hear his cattle calling as he is at the peak of his insanity. His dialogue treats the player as if they were a mouse, while he is the cat looking for his next meal. Margaret Baker takes this to another level, as she is heard spitting derogatory remarks at you while transforming her mood back and forth between calm and caring to cruel and explosive. The developers achieved a disturbing mirror of the mental torment that abusive family members might treat their victims with in real homes. While it did add extra tension to the chase sequences and cat and mouse events, my character Ethan Winters had no relation to the family and remained disconnected from their insanity, with very combative dialogue, disregarding the family as a bunch of nutcases most of the time. Along with the nutcases was Lucas Baker, the son of the family. His voice had a conniving tone and alerted me to my surroundings as he revealed my involvement in his mind games. I soon found out from the ticking sounds within boxes, which held explosives instead of loot, that Lucas was a trap master and the schemer of the family. It was a different tension disarming the traps around the house, similar to puzzle solving in other RE titles. When trap disarming, only to hear the molded creep up behind you is where it exceeds in scaring the player. Other than the sound design, I thought the save room theme summed up the atmosphere of a rainy day in Louisiana. I attribute it to the steel guitar ambience. It fit the Resident Evil universe very well, utilizing some of the familiar sounds found in earlier Resident Evil games as a background. Other than the save room, I was disappointed to hear a lack of notable themes throughout the game. Maybe these newer Resident Evil titles are getting their sound together enough that having music in the background of every scene would detract from the impact the sound design has on the world building and tension. Although there is a song at the end of the game that kept the tension running throughout the credits. Go Tell Aunt Rhody. It's based on a popular American folk song that I actually personally practiced on the guitar growing up. So to hear the song at the end with its twisted approach to familiar tunes, taking a kid's song and making it terrifying, left me with an unsettling nostalgia effect, and served as a great closure to this chapter in the series. Big spoilers up ahead. The story, although not much different from other Resident Evil titles in the grand scheme of plot design, the development team managed to hit the nail on the head during the first 2/3 of the game in terms of contextual horror. Ethan Winters is an average guy who receives a message from his missing wife to investigate her whereabouts and ends up tied up in a fight for his life. He barely has character building moments, which does make it difficult to see his story through, but what this allows the player to do is make an easier transition into the shoes of a man experiencing a spiral of madness around him. Not much is given to the player at the beginning in terms of his relationship to his wife Mia, and how she ended up missing. So when you find her at the Baker estate, and she tries to kill you numerous times, it ends up being half as effective as it could have been. It was hard for me to feel Ethan's heartbreak as he whacks and acts into his wife for the first time, since at this point, I've only seen her act strange and creepily towards Ethan upon their first meeting. Later on, it provides a great character progression as you end up playing as Mia aboard the abandoned ship that let loose the evil experiment Evelyn, and you find Mia's connection to Evelyn as a Special Forces operative, assigned to protect Evelyn as they transport her. Knowing Mia was a trained operative proved to kill the fear slightly, but the game mechanics throughout this section maintained a great deal of fear, so I'll retread her perspective later on. Evelyn as a character was a great addition to the building of the atmosphere. She appeared in the form of an elderly woman bound to a wheelchair throughout the early game. At first I thought of her as the grandma of the family, and thought nothing of her from a story standpoint. She made most of her appearances after large events such as boss fights. She eventually made the game extra creepy, such as when exiting the basement only to be met by her humming right around the corner. Grandmas aren't usually thought of as creepy, but they provide perfect tension when seemingly harmless, but watchful while stalking you from afar. After finding out Grandma is actually Evelyn, the evil little girl that controls all the molded, who suffered the side effects of this power by aging rapidly beyond control, she becomes even creepier, knowing the old lady sending all these monsters at you is also messing with your head constantly. She would stop at nothing to bend your mind to her. Throughout the game, she messes with the Bakers as well, telling Jack Baker that she would no longer have a use for Jack as the father of the family, since she wants Ethan to become the new father, alongside Mia as her mother. Ultimately, the Bakers are victims in this nightmare as well, as we see in the cutscene where Ethan becomes trapped in the hive mind of the molded, and Jack and Zoe's former selves are shown to be stuck there as well. Jack explains to Ethan how she warps their minds to bring the worst out of them, but that she only does it because she doesn't understand how else to bring the family together, which is all she ever wanted. I enjoyed this progression of the story because it shows us how even though Evelyn is the evil entity destroying all these people, the real villain is the secret corporation that made this girl into a monster by training her to associate what she wanted, a family, with her destructive abilities they engineered into her. Although the main game didn't explore this storyline as much, the entire game with the additional content explored the machinations of the entire plot. And I really enjoyed how the Bakers, by the end of it, were just evil entities whose former selves were victims of the whole ordeal. With such a big emphasis on the main cast of characters progressing through the story, it was easy to overlook some of the background and placeholder characters. Clancy was my favorite character in the entire series of Resident Evil. This is no joke. I thoroughly enjoyed the idea of a cameraman on a film crew who gets trapped in a random house while shooting his breakout television series, and proceeds to fight off horrid creatures and an insane family, only to die by the hands of the only family member who was crazy even before being possessed, Lucas Baker, who puts him through a series of puzzles and escape rooms that Clancy solves, but Lucas, being the psychopath that he is, just offs him anyways. Clancy leaves behind the only clue that allows Ethan Winters to survive the birthday room that killed him. Doing so lets Ethan outsmart Lucas by using the final VHS tape. I love this nod because it allows Clancy's efforts of surviving all of the family's abuse and end up getting killed to not be for nothing. In terms of horror, this context of fighting the insane people with the power of a sacrificed one's knowledge is 10 times more disturbing, but at the same time more empowering than the progression of Ethan Winters from scared average Joe to action hero, blasting away giant monsters. A small aside, I just realized I enjoy this game more than previous entries due in big part to its homage to other horror games and movies. Not just in the sense that it has everything from Texas Chainsaw Massacre or even possessed beings from The Exorcist. This game truly was attempting to break its formula of average Joes turning badass by trying out all the different horror subgenres that have worked before it. Now we move on to game mechanics. This will be the hardest topic to recall my original feelings and experience, since it took me multiple playthroughs to realize the game mechanics that took place. So I'll start with my favorite mechanic of RE7, the loot mechanic. If you ever played I Spy as a kid, you'd remember the intense focus involved in searching your environment, to then experiencing the joy in finding the object your opponent so cleverly hid from your view. This was implemented to great effect in RE7 when scanning your surroundings for the next item. I love that the items of higher value, such as cage coins and magnum ammo, were hidden beyond the ability to just scan the surface around you. To truly find the loot you needed the most, you would need to crouch and look in hard-to-reach places that were close to game-breaking levels of searching. Not only was the reward super useful in achieving survival, it was the rawest form of scare. Just imagine you lost your watch behind your couch, and just as the watch was within finger's reach, you were suddenly yanked out and flipped around to see your cousin in a scary mask. It's such a pull of emotion to go from a state of focus and calm to the sense of fright and disorientation. That's how I felt as I found shells to my favorite shotgun, only to be flipped around to the sight of Jack Baker and his burger meat-looking face. And then the scramble to reorient myself in the direction of flight through the winding passages of the Baker estate. This happened so often, but each time felt fresh, as it was always in a location I hadn't discovered items in yet. And the enemies were always off radar because of their ability to teleport to me somehow with the glitchy spawn system. Let's move to my second favorite level of the game, the attic of the rundown guest house. First, I'd like to call back to my graphics topic to acknowledge the level of atmosphere the attic achieves, just with its pitch-black contrast to the player character's dimly lit flashlight. This was most likely the instance that proved to the dev team that lighting would play a big role in their future games, as RE2 Remake goes on to improve the lighting engine massively. Additionally, there's some environmental storytelling through the possessed dolls and teddy bears along with the cryptic writing along the walls that only show up when you start to take notice. And this is where the subversion of expectations fulfills its role. Your character enters the room expecting enemies to pop out from the darkness, but instead you are met with teasing scares from harmless toys and the slow corruption of the environment as gooey tar oozes from the walls. It was terrifying leaving most of the room to my imagination, only to make me second-guess my fears as the devs pretended to jump scare me. And once I thought I experienced all the room had to offer, it threw some molded creatures into the mix, which kept me on my toes in case I became too familiar. Really, the subversion of expectations as I understand it is the balance between the familiar and the unknown, and understanding if your audience has lingered in one area or the other for too long. Going back to the context of Mia on the ghost ship, it was almost easy enough to forget this was a horror game, considering you played as a Special Forces lady who knew the extent of Evelyn's power, which would stifle the fear of the unknown. Except RE7 does something great here that usually is overdone in many other games. The devs had reset all your equipment so you would start with a dinky pistol again. This allowed the player to wonder how the hell they were going to defend themselves from here on out. Previously, it was getting to a point in the game where Ethan could look at an ammo pickup and say, "I might come back for it later. I've got enough ammo to storm an army of molded and take down their giant eyeball master." So to see Mia start all over brought back a lot of the tension. The first batch of DLC that we received focused heavily on Clancy's survival in the madhouse. The DLC was set up into episodes similar to the VHS minigames, and centered around Clancy right after he was kidnapped by Jack Baker. Then his encounter with Margaret Baker, and finally his encounter with Lucas Baker before his eventual death in Lucas's birthday room. First, Clancy was put into a horde mode situation, where Jack Baker leaves him in the basement and he has to survive 5 waves of molded monsters before he can escape. It was scary enough playing this the first few times, since the basement as a setting was terrifying on its own, but really it served as a fun mode and a decent story placeholder that only became repetitive after a while. The next mode finds Clancy locked in Grandma's room as Margaret is force-feeding him the baker's special, and he has to escape the room without alerting Margaret as she comes into the room from time to time to check on him. This mode was much more dreadful, since you had to hide all your puzzle progress in the room, because if Margaret spotted even a picture frame on the wrong wall, she would smack you up real good. This mode kept the tension dreadful, as every time I made a noise from solving a puzzle, I would have to rush to put everything back the way it was, and hurry up into bed before Margaret opened the door. And then she would charge into the room and look around vigorously, thinking I was up to no good. The developers did a pretty good job making it hard to tell if Margaret was gonna slap me or serve me my dinner. The last mode saw Clancy tied to a chair in one of Lucas's trap rooms with another victim across from him. You had to beat the opponent in a game of blackjack, except Lucas rigged the room into a Saw-like movie scenario. Between the electrocution therapy, getting your fingers chopped off, or taking a saw blade to the face, the stakes were always set high. I don't remember much fear in this mode, but there were moments where the flip of a card could mean Clancy's death, and those were always uncomfortable when I imagined being in his chair and leaving my fate to the flip of a card. These DLCs were fun, and the second one really brought the fear, but the most enjoyable aspect was just being able to connect the context of Clancy's situation to his imminent death and a vengeance. It was interesting to see such a small character in a game have such an extensive ordeal with the terror. It's rare for games to let you see the efforts of the side character, let alone experience his lead-up to an untimely death. And it's even rarer to experience all the trauma the character receives, and that's what I noticed was happening with Clancy. Clancy reacted much more lively than Ethan in many cases. I believe the reason Ethan didn't instill as much fear in the player is because he survived long enough to progress into an action hero. Speaking of action heroes, the rest of the DLCs were pretty much the only way someone could top Ethan's pedigree in action. The first of the two DLCs let you play as Chris Redfield, yes, the boulder-punching, roided-up one. Except now he's put into a first-person perspective, which still doesn't stop him from exploding monsters' heads with a punch from his curly biceps. Yup, not much horror here, but a cool perspective to experience VR in for the interactive HUD and night vision sequences. The second DLC follows Joe Baker, the brother of Jack. If punching power was not overtly expressed in the first DLC, then here it shines as the penultimate horror game turned into a joke, as Joe Baker is a professional boxer who lives off of the land as a country bumpkin. He pretty much eats bugs and punches heads off with his bare knuckles. It doesn't stop there. He's well versed in professional wrestling. He DDTs a transformed swamp version of Jack Baker, and then punches his head off with a hyper-tech super gauntlet that breaks the barriers of physics. I enjoyed these DLCs, but any ounce of fear experienced in the first DLC and vanilla game were completely forgotten after playing these last two DLCs. For my last topic, I wanted to really hit home the effect of immersion in Re7. Luckily, a few months ago, I was able to get my hands on a VR set, virtual reality set, on the PS4 for a decent price. Right away, I plugged in Re7, and although I was skeptical of a game's ability to surprise me, let alone strike fear again after so many playthroughs, I was still curious if VR was powerful enough to match the tech of gaming of the present. I set up the game in my living room and put on the headset and went through the tutorial at the beginning. Fine so far. Then I entered the menu area, and the first thing I noticed was the menu was changed to fit the VR settings. It was weird. I was in a room, but it wasn't my living room. I say this because I had my headphones on tight, my headset blocking any light from the living room, and my body standing in the middle of the room with no obstructions. I was in an isolation tank, where most of my senses were blocked from the outside world. Even better, the PS camera checked my body position and made it so the depth of view was relayed into game. I was able to stretch out towards objects and see them closer than I previously could without VR. Right away I would learn this meant an improvement in a lot of the jump scares, whereas before, the enemies could only get so close to the screen. But now, the monsters of Resident Evil would be right up next to my face, and if so, I could stretch out myself even closer towards, and even jump back from the monsters. I went through the game again on normal, experiencing much of the game similarly, but with an intensified sense of immersion. The walls, the ceiling, the atmosphere made me feel so much smaller than how I imagined it on screen. This effect was caused by the distance between my eyes and the screen, being so close that the scale of my character compared to everything around me became much less obstructed. When Ethan was pushed into the hole in the floor by Margaret, and you had to fend off her attacking bugs, it was insane to look up and feel yourself shrinking as waves of bugs swarmed you. Or when Jack Baker transformed into the giant grotesque eyeball monster. It felt very weird to look up at the creature and notice the magnitude of such a fight. Multiple times I felt as if the character I played as played a small part in the grander scheme of things, a very Lovecraftian horror that really opened my eyes to the degree the developers of the game went to provide all sorts of fear for the player. Along with these added effects, the mechanic that really made me adjust to this new horror was the aiming of the screen. Now, instead of aiming with a controller, I was aiming with my head. At first, it did not feel intuitive. My vision would shake when moving from place to place at a fast speed, and aiming for headshots was impossible against the possessed Mia. But soon I would find myself looking over my shoulder, checking for monsters or Jack Baker as he stalked me through the house. It was very weird that I would resort to my instincts when scared in a video game. On controller, the sensitivity wouldn't allow me to look around so fast, so I always felt suppressed in reaching my full immersion. But in VR, things such as hiding and peeking around corners could now occur instantly, so the hide and seek sessions turned into spikes of terror. Sometimes Jack could see me if I poked my head out too much from around the corner, and the moment he spotted me sent chills up my spine, as he now looked straight at me and proceeded to walk in my direction. In before, I would ignore many of the set pieces that progressed the story, such as the cop looking for me through the window, or Mia getting kidnapped by Lucas on the other side of the fence. But now in VR, there was always a perspective I could view the set piece from, leaning to the left, or right up to their nose, or squatting and looking up. Maybe it was the sheer novelty of never experiencing a VR set, but what I do know is that every scene felt much livelier. I left out a scene from the graphics topic so I could explain its full effect with the VR headset on. After getting knocked unconscious by Jack Baker and taken to the family house in the beginning, we are greeted with a family dinner. This scene is very memorable, having all the main antagonists at the table, including creepy grandma. And dare I make the comparison? It has a Texas Chainsaw Massacre dinner scene influence. The scene involves an introduction to the family's insanity, with Jack Baker cutting off his son's arm for being rude to the new guest Ethan, and then proceeds to force-feed us Margaret's nasty uncooked special meat, and then stabbing us in the mouth for spitting it out, while Grandma just chills to the side thinking about her next hiding spot to scare us from. I love how this first scene really sets up the VR capabilities, letting us squirm in the chair and really let the depth mechanic sink in. It's a great way to be introduced to the villains, and an even better way to be introduced to VR by taking in a spoonful of that nasty surprise that Lucas Baker seems so excited to chuck at our face from time to time. I wish we could experience an HD remaster of the scene alone for the next generation of VR and consoles, because the next issue is a glaring one. Now, this would be the crux of my praise for RE7, if it weren't for my passion for older games and their graphics. Pretty much all of the gnarly, gross, and gory inventions of the RE engine were reduced to blurry outlines of its former self. The game takes a hit in graphics because of the way VR is set up, which involves two separate screens that merge together to form a perspective similar to our eyes. Because of this, the amount of resolution needed in VR to interpret our surroundings without pixelation is 8K per eye, according to Plamer Lucky, the founder of the Oculus Rift. VR still has a long way to go before we can truly experience the immersion. For now, I will continue to enjoy RE7 VR like I do with older games, with a sense of imagination that fills in the blanks. To this day, I remember the feeling I had when I first left the safe house to explore the streets of the apocalyptic Raccoon City from Resident Evil 3. How stark and deserted it felt. It's games like these make it their goal to leave a lasting impression that will open you to the idea of the art and expression in horror. I'm happy to say Resident Evil 7 continues this sentiment as it opens the doors for even more people to experience the horror. The fear was displaced in segments and led to moments that broke the tension, and the steady progression of Ethan as an action hero dissipated the fear near the end. Resident Evil 7 showed many ways of instilling fear that you can't help but feel curious to go back and experience it again and again. It shows us that horror games don't need to solely focus on a main character to know the fear. It showed us that games can take a risk and retread mechanics that couldn't work before but work exceptionally now. If this game is anything to go by on Capcom's records, it shows us they know what made the Resident Evil franchise great as a horror series. Would I recommend the game to the average horror fan? Hell yeah. It's in my top 10 list of horror games. Would I recommend the VR version? Only if you can get past the graphics downgrade. I say it's an experience unlike any other game you've played. In the spirit of trying something new, I decided to rate the scariness of the game. My rating system goes from not scary at all, to spooky but cheesy, to cheap scares here and there, to hair-raisingly scary, and finally, to frightening as hell. For a single playthrough experience on normal difficulty, I give it a frightening as hell. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who took the time to watch my content. Your support as the viewer fuels these videos beyond belief, and I hope they add that extra spice to your horror gaming. This game means a lot to me as a horror fan, and I hope I was able to do it justice. Check out the links below to see all the awesome channels and supplements that really made this video possible. This channel is really coming together, and I wouldn't be able to do it if it weren't for you, the viewers. So thank you, and join me next time as we delve into a notorious indie game that I have yet to endure. Lost in Vivo. I'm already dreading the idea of sewers. Click the like button if you'd spit out the family dinner, or subscribe so I can say, "Welcome to the family, son."